Hi, this is Brock and Eileen from Digital Drifters at Perito Moreno Glacier, and we wanted to introduce you to my friend Scott that I went to high school, middle school with. I hadn't talked to him since like high school graduation, and I had seen on Facebook that he was in Santiago, Chile, so I reached out to him and we met up with him in Santiago for brunch, and we learned that he's a geologist, geomorphologist doing glacier research here in Patagonia.
So we were able to sit Scott down and kind of pick his brain to kind of see, just say in layman's terms, what everyone can do to do their part to help the environment. In regard to glaciers, like just because you don't live by glaciers doesn't mean that it doesn't affect you. So we just wanted everyone to just hear with open ears and just listen to the video and really truly take it in. So here's Scott and Brock in our interview.
Yeah, perfect. You ready? Yeah. I study past variations in glaciers, specifically in Patagonia in South America, south of about 46 degrees latitude. The reason I'm studying them is to reconstruct climate changes in the past, to say, okay, at time X, the glacier was advanced, and therefore it must have been colder and or wetter to make the glacier become more expanded. And then in time Y, when the glacier retreated, there must have been some other type of climatic change that had occurred to affect the glaciers in that way. That's really, really important in the context of what we're seeing right now in terms of climate change and glacier change. For me, one of the the strongest signal of long-term global warming that we have right now is just the global retreat of like nearly every single glacier in the world. It's a super strong long-term signal that something is really fundamentally changing about the Earth's system. So I study glacial landforms, like little traces of the glacier that have been left on the land surface. And I have various methods of dating those landforms to say, okay, at this time the glacier was here, at this time the glacier was here, at this time the glacier was here.
And when we're at Cerro Castillo, you could see you call them moraines.
Moraines, yeah.
The deposits of rock that are just so defined. They're just like lines in the surface.
Yeah,
there.
And it was really helpful to have Brock there, because he has a lot of different methods of sort of capturing, of like looking at what's going on, like looking sort of. I have like images, satellite images, and then I can see what I have on the ground, but I'm sort of missing sort of like the in between. And Brock's footage, I think, is really going to be a tremendous help.
Put the drone up there.
Tremendous help for just sort of like picturing it and describing it, and really ultimately communicating to people, okay, this is how this site looks, for people who haven't yet had the opportunity to come and visit that area. So it was really this synergy sort of between geography, glaciology. It's just so bizarre. I mean, like,
And I took a geomorphology class in college. So.
Yeah, and I took GIS.
Wow.
Nerds unite.
Hey, nerds unite.
Earth nerds. Yeah.
In the research that you've done so far, have you seen the glaciers actually recede? Like, have you seen a significant difference already?
Yes.
And what's the time frame that you're speaking of?
Yeah, so every glacier is a little bit different in terms of how it responds to changes in the climate. So that's due in part because the climate in all over the world is like there's a lot of regional, local variability, a lot of local factors that go into it. And also the shape of the glacier makes a big difference. The context of where the glacier is. If the glacier is emptying into a body of water, for instance, it can do some really bizarre things. Sometimes they can retreat really rapidly. And these are the ones that where I have personally seen the most retreat, sort of like in my life. There's one glacier called Marinelli. It's in the very far south of Patagonia that has retreated at just a tremendous distance, maybe like 13 kilometers in the last 40 years or something like that.
Wow.
So with those glaciers, you can really track the sort of like the lateral retreat of the glacier, the way that it's continually losing mass from the front. But what's really impressive is how much it's losing mass.
The depth, yeah.
Vertically too, which is something that's really important as well when we're thinking about the volume of the system. So you have some glaciers that are retreating a very small amount. You have some glaciers that are just collapsing entirely. But I think the important thing there is that, like, with all these local, regional factors that are involved in the in glacier mass balance, what we call it, the global trend is really clear. They're all losing mass. They're within at least 95% of them, more greater than 2 sigma of the all the glaciers in the world are losing mass. So the variations for me, they're interesting, sort of from an academic perspective. They're interesting to think about, oh yeah, this glacier is, it's in this particular context and therefore it's doing something different than the other glaciers. But fundamentally, they're all losing mass. And so even in spite of all these little factors that can go into it. So I think that's a really strong indication for me that something is really changing at a global scale.
And for those listening that might live, say, in the U.S., that in Arizona, like where we used to live, that aren't exposed to glaciers, they don't really know much. Like, why should this be a concern for them?
So there's 2 sort of, I would say, levels to that. That's a good question. The first is that the glaciers, where you can find them all over the globe, really. You have to go a lot higher in the tropics to find glaciers, but you see them there. And what the glaciers provide is they provide a longer-term registry of climate change than the instrumental record. So so if you're looking at instrumental records, they vary like quite a bit, from year to year. It's like some years you have warmer years, some years you have colder years. But they tend, if you have a long enough time scale, a long enough instrumental record, you can see trends and stuff. The glaciers do not respond instantaneously to these annual changes in climate. Yeah. They sort of they serve as like a way of smoothing out the interannual variability, the year-to-year variability in your climate. And so I'd say the first thing that the glaciers, why the glaciers are important in the context of climate change, is that they are telling us that something is happening over a really long, over like hundreds of years. You look at, and what I do, like what my studies are focused on is looking at glacier change beyond the last 100 years, beyond the instrumental record. And something that you see very frequently is that since the start of the Industrial Revolution, the 1800s, that's when globally all your glaciers have really started to, that's like the point at which things have started to really start to, where the glaciers changed from advancing to a retreating state. So over the last 200 years, yeah, it's been pretty strong. So they're telling us something about the climate across the entire world, not just in Patagonia, not just in the Arctic, but like wherever in all latitudes, all sort of rain climatic zones in the world. The second part is that the glaciers can also influence climate directly, or influence us directly when they start to change. One area that's really concerning for people who study glaciers is West Antarctica. The ice there is retreating. It's losing mass at a really rapid rate. And there's a worry that the ice that's there is sort of holding a lot of the rest of the ice in Antarctica back. It's like keeping it inside Antarctica. It's a barrier.
If the front end falls out, it could be a mass loss.
Exactly. If you lose that barrier, then a lot of the ice in Antarctica can just like flood out of can flood out through this hole in the wall, so to speak, that's been made. That can affect things like ocean circulation. That'll affect your weather patterns, especially in the south. But what's really worrisome about that is the effect that it has on sea level. So what we know about how glaciers have changed in the past, we've had ice ages and we have like warm periods. And during the ice ages, because there's so much ice trapped in the glaciers, the sea level drops like a really, really large amount, over 100 meters. When the ice melts, then the sea level rises. So right now, in like the long-term period, in like the long-term time scale, we're actually at a time when sea level is pretty high. But we still have a lot of ice left. So the question then is, what happens if that ice melts? Well, it's got to go somewhere, and it goes into the ocean. But the ocean can only take so much without having to expand to accommodate this extra water. So I say the second thing that's important about glaciers in terms of climate change is that glacier change can actually have a very direct effect on the global system, on the oceans, at the local scale too. We have in Chile in particular, there's a lot of hazards that are associated with melting glaciers. There's a greater risk of floods, debris flows. There was events last year, 2 years ago, in a place called Villa Santa Lucia.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about 200 kilometers north of here, where there was a really large landslide that occurred in a glacial area. It was basically, this landslide came down and landed on this piece of sort of like debris that was partially frozen that used to be, 30 years ago, part of a glacier. The glacier had melted and it had left this big wet mass of rock and ice on the ground that was really, really unstable. So when this landslide happened, hit that stuff, it all flowed downhill. It cut the main highway and very unfortunately killed a number of people. They were killed by this flood that you could say is linked to climate change. It wouldn't have happened if the glacier were there, if it were stable. And so at the local scale too, there's a lot of reasons why glacier change is really sort of important for the people who live near them. But again, for the people who live in Arizona, in the United States where there are no glaciers, I'd say first of all, the glaciers indicate that the climate is changing worldwide, and second of all, glacier change can have a direct impact on places that don't have any glaciers at all.
Yeah. So maybe they're not gonna have a landslide or be flooded out by a glacier, but the climate could, indicate that there's a change coming in the areas that these people live.
Absolutely, absolutely. So one thing living in Chile has one of the really interesting little things about living in Chile is that there's a whole category of fashion here called ropa americana. There are stores that sell American clothes, is the English translation for it.
Like hand-me-down?
It's 100% hand-me-downs.
Yeah.
Or like clothes that were discarded from the United States. And it's not like it's stuff that's torn. It's not like it's stuff that's worn out or like past its use. It's basically new. In a lot of cases it is new. It's just things that didn't sell in the United States. If I did a little bit of research into that, I found that Chile is the #1 importer of United States clothing.
Wow.
Like we send more clothing to Chile than any other country in the world. And it's become this whole sort of industry here. It's perceived as being of higher quality and stuff like that than some of the other clothes. But you just look at that and you're just like, well, why does this even exist? It exists because the amount of clothes that we discard in the United States, at the very least, is just enormous. It's enormous, and why? It's because of the way that clothes are produced, and more than the way that clothes are produced, it's the way that they're marketed. Certainly now, in like the age of fast fashion and stuff like that, there's a tremendous social pressure for us to always be sort of like changing the way that we look. We have this idea that our identity is really, really tied to the clothes that we wear.
Every season you need to get new clothes to match the new trend.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you want to change your lifestyle, if you want to become, like a different person who does a different activity, then you have to change your uniform. which fundamentally is not true. You know, like who you are is based much more on like what you do, and you know how you express yourself, the actions that you the concrete actions that you take, than like what clothes you wear. The one thing that someone could do, like for sure, that would definitely help, is just buy fewer clothes. You know, using the clothes example as just one type of example. But you know, as a rule, I think that generally applies for almost anything. Really.
Anything, yeah.
Yeah. Is that, you know, just you. There's a lot of things that exist in this world that are not necessary for humans to live and be happy, because many more humans than exist in the United States live on much less than people in the United States live with, and are
Much
happy.
happier.
Maybe, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, they,
Yeah.
you know, by various metrics, they are
Well,
happy.
because they're not pressured to meet the expectations of society.
Exactly.
This delusion that society has created
Yeah.
in the U.S. and other developed countries.
Or that the way that you show your affection for someone, the way that you show you care, the way that you the way that you sort of interact socially with people is tied to the purchase of products. It existed much long. Our relationships with other people and our relationships with the environment, they've existed much longer than this world in which you can buy something to sort of to achieve that same goal.
Yeah.
And so it's not like, okay, we take away all the gifts and like, oh, you know, nobody's gonna like me and I'm gonna freaking, you know, like I'm just gonna be like this antisocial tool or something like that. It's like, well, no. People have interacted with each other for much longer than has existed this system in which we show our affection for people, or that
Yeah.
we show, or that all these consumer products are tied to our social lives.
Final thoughts. If you had to talk to everybody in the world, this is the last thing you could tell them in hopes of them being able to save humanity, what would you tell them?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a pretty Eileen, you're really
Loaded question.
that's a very heavy question, Eileen. I mean, I mean, I'm not going to say that I have the answer to everything, but I think so. I used to have sort of like this very pessimistic view of, you know, the destiny of everybody, just given all the changes we're seeing, and it like, you know, I'd be like, oh, you know, there have to be less people, you know, like we have to all live in like, I don't know, tiny little cubicles and like use horse-drawn wagons and stuff like that, in order to actually make a meaningful change. And I think that was a position that was not really well informed at the end of the day, because that was the idea that I had before. You know, I really started to consider how consumption differs, like in all the world, between countries, between regions, between different populations of people. And when you start to consider sort of like your personal impact on the world and how it relates to the impact that other people have on the world, I think a lot of people, certainly from the United States and from Europe, will come to the conclusion that, like, wow, okay, the things that we consume a lot more things than other people do right now in the world, in other parts of the world, and more things than our grandparents and our great-grandparents did as well. And so the little changes, and I'm calling them little because they seem like very small things to do, the little changes that we make actually do have a really, really big impact, because it's the sum of all these little changes that have happened in our lifestyle that has led to this dramatic increase in the emission of greenhouse gases, in the pollution that we see in our environments since the 1950s. It's an artificial world that was created. You can debate why it was created or how it came to be, but like the world in which, you know, Brock, you and I grew up in, is not the only possibility. And we can make changes that seem small to us that actually in the big scheme of things are actually really significant, because the people who are most empowered to make these changes are the people who currently have the biggest effect on the environment. So any little changes that people who have a big effect on the environment can make, they're actually pretty big changes.
Okay, so we really hope that you guys enjoyed this video. It kind of just brings to light everything that's actually going on in the, all around the world. The only reason that we're able to understand kind of what's going on is because we've been traveling so much, and we've been blessed and we have the opportunity to do it. But we just want everyone to know that no matter what you do make an impact. Stopping using straws, using reusable bags at the grocery store, everything you do makes a difference. So we just want to emphasize that, and we hope that you guys like this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share this video to kind of get the word out, and we hope you like it. Bye!